The Library of Alexandria is described in most accounts as a catastrophic accident, a fire that consumed an irreplaceable repository of ancient knowledge and left Western civilization philosophically impoverished for 1,000 years. But when you examine the historical record of which texts survived the multiple destructions of Alexandria, which did not, and what the surviving fragments consistently point toward without containing, the distribution of losses is far too coherent to be explained by the physics of fire and the randomness of war. Something was selected. The question this video answers is not what burned. It is who decided what wouldn't. The standard history of Alexandria's destruction assigns the blame across 3 events. Julius Caesar's Alexandrian War in 48 BC, a fire that may have burned a warehouse near the harbor containing books being exported, not the main library building itself. The decree of Emperor Theodosius in 391 AD, under which Bishop Theophilus destroyed the Serapeum, the temple complex that by then housed the primary remaining ancient manuscript collection, and the Arab conquest of 642 AD under Caliph Omar, though later scholarship has substantially questioned both the scale and the intent of this final event. 3 acts, 3 centuries, 1 story, accident, religious zealotry, conquest. Forces that destroy indiscriminately. The problem is that the texts that survived these 3 successive destructions are not distributed indiscriminately. What survived falls into consistent categories. Philosophical texts that describe but do not instruct. Mathematical and geometrical texts that map structure without specifying application. Astronomical texts that document the movements of celestial bodies without describing the operative relationship between celestial mechanics and human consciousness that the ancient tradition maintained. Medical texts, historical records, literary works. The pattern of survival maps almost precisely onto what the Egyptian priestly tradition, over 2,000 years of active maintenance before Alexandria existed, had categorized as appropriate for wide reproduction, and the pattern of non-survival maps onto exactly what that same tradition had categorized as restricted. Before we go deeper, if this kind of buried evidence speaks to you, subscribe to the channel. This is where we keep uncovering what was deliberately set aside. The project Ptolemy Sota, commissioned around 295 BC, was philosophically unprecedented in a specific way that most historical accounts understate. His advisor Demetrius of Phalerum, a student of Aristotle, proposed not a royal library, but a universal one. Every book in the world in one place. Ptolemy III took this further. Ships arriving in Alexandria were required to surrender their books for copying, and in documented cases the originals were kept and the copies returned. This was not casual acquisitiveness. It was systematic, deliberate accumulation of all written knowledge that existed. The Egyptian priest-scribes, who were custodians of the oldest written tradition in the Mediterranean world, would have understood immediately what this Greek universal access project represented, and they would have responded with a principle their tradition had maintained for over 2,000 years. What goes to the Mausion is what is appropriate for the Mausion. The 42 books of Thoth are the specific subject of this video. But understanding why their loss matters differently from the general loss of ancient literature requires understanding who Thoth actually was in the Egyptian tradition before the Greeks gave him a Greek name. The word Thoth is Greek transliteration. The Egyptian name is Jehuti, and what the Egyptians meant by Jehuti is significantly more specific than the god of writing. Jehuti was the cosmic principle through which the universe registers itself, not a deity who happens to write, but the ontological function of self-knowing through which the universe maintains coherent structure. When the Egyptians attributed 42 books to Jehuti, they were not saying that a god wrote 42 volumes. They were saying that these 42 books encoded the principle by which the cosmos organizes itself into knowable pattern. The name matters. The distinction between Thoth, the scribe god, and Jehuti, the principle of cosmic self-registration, is not etymological trivia. It is the key to understanding why anyone would want to destroy them specifically. The Greek Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes, the figure who became the anchor of the entire Western esoteric tradition, was the syncretic entity that emerged when Greek philosophers encountered Jehuti in Egypt and recognized in the Egyptian cosmic principle the same fundamental function they called nous in their own philosophical tradition. Nous, the divine mind, the primordial intelligence through which all existence maintains its coherent structure. Jehuti, the same function expressed in the Egyptian symbolic vocabulary. The identification of Hermes with Thoth was not a cultural conflation born of similarity. It was a recognition of structural identity, the same principle carrying the same function in two distinct cultural vocabularies. When Clement of Alexandria described a body of texts as the books of Hermes, he was describing the books of Jehuti, the books through which the cosmic principle of self-registration had been encoded in material form. 42 of them. The phrase, complete knowledge of the universe, attached to the 42 books since at least Clement's description, requires translation from within the Egyptian cosmological framework. What did complete mean in this context? The Egyptian term for the governing principle of the universe was ma'at, truth, justice, cosmic order, the foundational law through which the universe maintains coherent structure. Complete knowledge, in this framework, did not mean encyclopedic coverage of all observable phenomena. It meant knowledge of how Ma'at operates, the actual mechanics by which the universe maintains its coherent structure, and by extension, knowledge of how a human being can come into alignment with that mechanic rather than in opposition to it. The breadth of categories in Clement's catalogue, medicine, astronomy, music, consciousness after death, reflects the range of domains in which Ma'at's technical operation can be studied and applied. They are not separate subjects. They are the same principle observed at different scales. If what we're covering is landing with you as more than historical curiosity, write in the comments today's date and finish the sentence, "I inherited what they couldn't burn." Clement of Alexandria wrote his Stramata around 200 AD. A period when the Alexandrian library tradition was still substantially intact. He gives us the most complete surviving catalogue of what the 42 books contained, and it is worth staying with the catalogue longer than the standard summaries allow. 10 books on the priestly theological tradition, hymns, cosmological maps, descriptions of the structure of divine reality. 10 books on ritual and law, the operative codes through which the tradition interacted with the divine structure. 2 books on music, not music as aesthetic category, but music as the operative principle through which sound affects the structure of consciousness and matter, which the Egyptian tradition treated as a technical field. 4 books on astronomy and the cosmic order. 6 books on medicine. This is already remarkable. 42 books are roughly equivalent to 42 full academic treatises, but it is the final categories in Clement's catalogue that deserve specific attention. Books on the hieroglyphic writing system at its deepest level, books on what lies beneath the surface of the material world, and the category he names last and most briefly, the books on what happens to consciousness after the body stops functioning. The category of books on post-mortem consciousness is the one that the later institutional tradition had the most immediate motivation to suppress. Every religious institution that emerged after Alexandria burned built significant authority on the claim to know what happens after death and to mediate that transition. A technical manual on the mechanics of post-mortem consciousness, written by a civilization that had maintained precisely calibrated practices for navigating that transition across 3,000 years, available in a library to any literate person, would eliminate one of the primary leverage points of any religion whose authority depends on exclusive knowledge of what lies beyond death. This is not speculative motive. The Inquisition burned texts it considered dangerous to institutional authority. The Bishop Theophilus burned the Serapeum. The pattern of institutional motivation to suppress operative knowledge of death and consciousness is not hypothetical. It is documented behavior. But the problem with framing the Alexandria destruction as intentional suppression of the afterlife books is that it assigns too much coherence to what was likely a more distributed process. The more accurate frame is structural. The Egyptian tradition had already been managing the distribution of this knowledge for over 2,000 years before the library burned. The tradition distinguished between what the temples called the House of Life, the accessible scholarly library, and the innermost chamber, restricted materials. When Ptolemy I founded the Mausion and began collecting all the world's knowledge, the Egyptian temple tradition responded to this Greek universal access institution with a principle the tradition had maintained since the Old Kingdom. What goes to the Mausion is what is appropriate for the Mausion. The most operative texts stayed in the temples, not because anyone specifically hid them from Ptolemy, because the tradition had an existing category for what should be widely available, and the Mausion fell into that category's domain. The 2 books on music in Clement's catalogue are underappreciated. In the Egyptian operative tradition, music was not an art form, it was a technology. The relationship between specific vibrational frequencies and specific states of consciousness was a studied field, not in the intuitive sense that music affects mood, which everyone knows, but in the technical sense that specific combinations of tonal intervals produce specific and reproducible changes in the coherence of consciousness. The Pythagorean tradition, which inherited significant components of its numerical and harmonic philosophy from Egyptian priestly instruction, preserved fragments of this operative harmonic knowledge in the doctrine of the music of the spheres, which was not a metaphor in the original tradition. It was a description of how specific celestial configurations generate specific harmonic frequencies that affect consciousness in specific ways. 2 entire books on this field, gone. The 4 books on astronomy in Clement's catalogue present the reconstruction problem most clearly. The observational precision of Egyptian astronomy is well documented. The orientation of temples like Abu Simbel to the sunrise on specific dates with sub-degree accuracy, the astronomical ceiling of the tomb of Senenmut mapping hundreds of stars in positions that modern astronomers have confirmed, the Dendera zodiac encoding astronomical data with extraordinary precision. But what motivated that precision? What required millennia of careful celestial observation in a desert civilization? The answer in the operative Egyptian astronomical tradition is not academic interest. The celestial positions were tracked because specific configurations had documented reproducible effects on consciousness. The 4 astronomical books in the 42 books catalogue mapped those effects systematically. What survived is the observational precision, the exact positions of stars and planets across centuries. What did not survive is the documented relationship between those positions and the states of consciousness they produce. The Picatrix, compiled in Arabic in the 10th century from earlier Greek and Coptic sources, translated into Latin in 1256 for Alfonso X of Castile, is the most explicit surviving document describing the operative relationship between celestial configurations and consciousness that the Egyptian astronomical tradition apparently mapped in detail. The Picatrix describes specific planetary configurations and their documented effects on human consciousness. prescribes specific practices for working with those effects, and attributes its contents to transmission from what it calls the wise men of Egypt and Babylon. Modern scholars categorize it as a medieval magical text. What its internal structure reveals is a fragment of exactly the operative relationship between astronomy and consciousness that the 4 astronomical books in Clement's catalogue would have described systematically. The observational data survived in mainstream astronomical tradition. The operative application survived in the Picatrix, in fragments, in a context that ensured most scholars would not take it seriously. The mechanism of preservation mirrors the mechanism of loss. What arrives in a form that institutional authority dismisses persists precisely because authority doesn't need to suppress it. If this content is opening something in you, let me know by liking this video. It helps more people find this at the right moment. The temple inscriptions at Edfu in Upper Egypt give us another angle on what the 42 books contained and what was deliberately withheld even within the Egyptian tradition. The Edfu temple, built during the Ptolemaic period on foundations dating back to the Old Kingdom, contains one of the most detailed surviving catalogues of what an Egyptian sacred library held. The Edfu inscription lists the contents of the House of Life attached to the temple, and the catalogue includes titles corresponding to several of Clement's categories. But it also contains a category that Clement's catalogue does not include: texts described as the secret of secrets. The inscription acknowledges their existence, notes that they are held in the innermost chamber of the House of Life, and describes their contents as known to the initiates of the innermost grade. W. The inscription catalogues a category it cannot describe. The existence of the category survives in the inscription. The content does not. What the Edfu inscription reveals is that the Egyptian tradition maintained multiple layers of restriction within its own library, and that the outer layer of the House of Life was itself already a restricted library relative to what the innermost chamber held. The 42 books, which Clement describes as containing the complete knowledge, may themselves have been the outer layer of this nested restriction system, complete in the sense of being the most complete written version of what the tradition had decided should be in written form, not complete in the sense of containing everything the tradition knew. The tradition's knowledge existed in at least 3 tiers: publicly accessible, scholarly, and operative restricted. The 42 books sat at the scholarly tier. Above them was something the Egyptians never committed to any material that could be burned. Iamblichus, writing in his De Mysteris around 300 AD, a century after Clement and a century before the Serapeum destruction, provides a description of the Hermetic books that adds a dimension Clement's catalogue does not contain. Iamblichus states that the books attributed to Hermes Trismegistus were written, according to the Egyptian priestly tradition itself, before the foundation of the physical world, that the writings of Jehuti were primordial documents the tradition had been entrusted with preserving, not producing. This claim has a structural implication that cannot be dismissed. It means the tradition understood itself as custodians of something pre-existing rather than authors of something created. Custodianship is structurally different from authorship. An author can summarize, adapt, and reproduce. A custodian transmits intact or fails the transmission. The Egyptian priest-scribes understood themselves as maintaining the integrity of a transmission whose original source was older than their civilization, which is why the tiered access system was not optional. It was a custodial responsibility that could not be delegated to a universal library. The destruction of Alexandria was not a single event, and the specific timeline matters for understanding what was lost when. The Mouseion, the main research library founded by Ptolemy V, may have been damaged in Caesar's 48 BC fire, but the scholarly consensus now places the main collection's survival into the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, with gradual deterioration and partial collection transfer to the Serapeum complex. The Serapeum destruction in 391 AD under Theophilus is the most significant loss event for specifically Egyptian materials, because the Serapeum was not just a library, but a functioning temple complex. Its library included temple materials that would never have been deposited in the secular Mausoleum. When Theophilus burned the Serapeum, he was not burning a collection of Greek philosophical texts. He was burning the last major institutionally held collection of Egyptian priestly manuscripts in a functioning temple context. The phrase "house of life," parank in Egyptian, describes an institution categorically different from a library in the modern or Hellenistic sense. A library in the Greek conception is a repository of texts available for consultation by qualified scholars. A house of life was a functioning center of production, transmission, maintenance, and application of knowledge, simultaneously scriptorium, academy, ritual space, and medical facility. The texts within it were not stored as completed products, but maintained as living documents, copied, updated, and used in ongoing operative practice. When the Serapeum burned in 391 AD, Theophilus did not end a collection of finished manuscripts. He ended a functioning institution. The manuscripts were the documentary layer of a living practice. When the institution burned, the practice ended. The surviving texts became artifacts rather than operating documents. The difference between a text read by a practitioner inside a living tradition and the same text read by a scholar outside that context is the difference between an instrument in the hands of its player and an instrument in a museum. The instrument survives. The music does not. In the Hermopolitan creation tradition, one of the four major Egyptian cosmogonies, centered in the city of Kmun, later Hermopolis, the universe came into existence through the act of cosmic naming. Jehuti spoke the first word. That word was the universe's own name. The principle here is not religious mythology in the dismissive modern sense. It is a cosmological claim about the relationship between language, structure, and existence, that the universe is fundamentally a self-referential system that knows itself through the medium of consciousness, and that Jehuti represents the principle by which that self-knowledge is encoded and transmitted. The 42 books on this reading are not books about the universe. They are the universe's own self-description, encoded in material form. Their loss was not cultural impoverishment, it was the severing of a transmission line between the cosmos and the human consciousness capable of receiving its self-description. If what we're uncovering here clarifies something you've been looking for, I left something in the first pinned comment. It's for those who are ready to go further than the surviving fragments. Theophilus knew what he was burning. This claim requires substantiation, and the substantiation exists. Theophilus was not an ignorant zealot. He was a sophisticated theological politician who had spent years navigating the relationship between the emerging Christian orthodoxy and the pagan philosophical traditions of Alexandria. He was familiar with the Hermetic texts. The Corpus Hermeticum was circulating in Alexandria during his lifetime. He was familiar with the Neoplatonic tradition. His campaign against the pagan temples and their libraries was not driven by ignorance of what those libraries contained. It was driven by awareness of exactly what they contained and the institutional threat that awareness represented. A bishop who understood the relationship between the Hermetic tradition and the claims of institutional Christianity had specific, informed motivation to destroy specifically the operative texts that the temple collections held. Rufinus of Aquileia was present in Alexandria during Theophilus's campaign against the pagan temples and left an eyewitness account that survives in his Historia Ecclesiastica. His description of the Serapeum destruction in 391 AD contains a detail that standard summaries omit. Rufinus describes the interior of the Serapeum complex as having multiple rooms, housing both the cult image of Serapis and what he calls a great library. And he notes that the soldiers and Christian mob who entered the complex treated the books differently from the cult objects. The cult image was destroyed ceremonially, the books were burned. Rufinus does not comment on this distinction, but the distinction is present in his account. The statue was a symbol to be desecrated. The books required physical destruction. The institutional logic of burning specifically, rather than destroying, relocating or confiscating, is the logic of ending transmission rather than merely displacing it. You relocate what you want to keep unavailable. You burn what you need to ensure cannot be reconstituted. The Nag Hammadi texts were buried, scholars estimate, in approximately 370 AD, 20 years before Theophilus destroyed the Serapeum. Someone was already hiding texts before the main destruction event. This is not a minor historical footnote. It means that someone in the Egyptian Neoplatonic or Gnostic tradition had specific knowledge that the institutional destruction was coming, understood which texts were at most risk, and acted to preserve them. The Nag Hammadi collection is not a random cross-section of ancient manuscripts. It is a selection, 13 codices, 52 texts, almost exclusively operative or proto-operative material, texts describing the mechanism of liberation from material identification, the architecture of consciousness, the relationship between the individual mind and the divine source. The selection is coherent. Whoever buried the jar understood the distinction between what the institutional tradition would preserve and what it would lose. The most likely candidates for the burial of the Nag Hammadi codices are the monks of the Pachomian monastery at Chenoboskion, located approximately 5 kilometers from the discovery site. The Pachomian monastery was not a Gnostic institution. It was a mainstream Egyptian Christian community, one of the earliest organized monastic communities in the world. The monks who buried these texts were not the communities that produced them. They were preservers of a tradition they may not have fully understood, acting under the pressure of Bishop Theophilus' campaigns against heterodox texts. Someone within or adjacent to that community understood that these specific texts were at risk and chose concealment over compliance. That choice, made by someone whose identity is unknown, is the reason we have the discourse on the 8th and 9th today. The discourse on the 8th and 9th in the Nag Hammadi collection is the single most significant fragment of what the 42 books contained. It was not in any medieval manuscript tradition. It was not copied by monks. It was buried in a sealed jar in the Egyptian desert and recovered in 1945. The text describes a practice, not a philosophy, not a cosmological map, but an operative procedure, for moving consciousness through the 7 planetary spheres and beyond, into what the text calls the Ogdoad, 8th sphere, and the Ennead, 9th. The standard Hermetic transmission ends at the 7th sphere. The discourse on the 8th and 9th describes what is beyond. It is not describing these higher spheres as theoretical destinations. It is describing the experience of being in them, with the specificity of someone who had navigated the path and was documenting the route. This is operative knowledge. This is the category that the institutional tradition never transmitted. This is what the 42 books contained. The Ogdoad, the 8th, that the discourse on the 8th and 9th describes, requires unpacking from the Hermopolitan cosmological system if the text's significance is to be understood. In the standard Hermetic cosmological map, the material world is surrounded by 7 spheres corresponding to the 7 classical planets. Consciousness descends through these spheres at birth, acquiring a garment from each, a layer of conditioning, limitation, and particular cognitive orientation. The path of return, gnosis, involves shedding each garment as consciousness rises back through the spheres, recovering the nature it had before descent. This is the map that all the surviving Hermetic texts describe. What they do not describe is what comes after the seventh sphere. The discourse on the eighth and ninth describes what it is like to be in the Ogdoad. The 42 books apparently described how to get there. The destination survived in one document. The route did not survive anywhere. The Hermetic fragments, preserved by Stobaeus, a 5th century anthologist who collected excerpts from Hermetic texts that have since been lost, contain passages that appear nowhere in the Corpus Hermeticum's 17 books. The Stobaeus fragments describe levels of the return path that the 17 books reference but do not explain. They describe specific practices for shedding the material garments at each sphere. They describe the phenomenology of the transition, what it feels like when the lunar garment releases, what changes in perception when the mercurial layer dissolves. These fragments survived accidentally. Stobaeus preserved them as philosophical excerpts without understanding their operative significance. They are among the clearest surviving windows into what was in the books Clement catalogued, and they are consistent with the overall picture. The Hermetic tradition possessed operative knowledge that made its way into some texts, was filtered out of others, and exists now in scattered fragments distributed across several disparate ancient sources. The specific passages Stobaeus preserved that cannot be found in the Corpus Hermeticum are procedural in character, where the corpus is phenomenological. Where the Corpus Hermeticum describes the experience of gnosis, what it feels like when the nous recognizes itself, several Stobaeus fragments describe preparatory conditions in language that is procedural rather than descriptive. They describe what the practitioner must have established before the recognition can occur, what orientation of consciousness is required, what the specific obstacles are at each of the first 7 spheres, and how those obstacles manifest in the individual's cognitive and emotional patterns. This is the layer that all the surviving texts approach and then step back from. The Corpus Hermeticum knows the destination and describes it beautifully. The Stobaeus fragments know the path to the first checkpoint. Neither provides the complete route. Together, they confirm that a complete route existed because their partial descriptions are internally consistent and point toward the same structural system. The root was in the 42 books. What survives is the root's shadow. The 6 medical books in Clement's catalogue deserve specific attention for what they reveal about the integrated understanding of body and consciousness in the 42 books tradition. The surviving Egyptian medical papyri, the Ebers papyrus, the Edwin Smith papyrus, demonstrate a sophisticated empirical medical tradition, but they also demonstrate a system that treats the physical body as simultaneously a material and a subtle energy system. The Edwin Smith papyrus's treatment of neurological injuries shows an empirical precision that is stunning for the period. The Ebers papyrus's treatments involve both physical interventions and what would be called energetic or consciousness-based interventions in modern terminology. The medical books in the 42 books catalogue, based on Clement's description, went significantly further than the surviving papyri, specifically in describing the relationship between states of consciousness and specific physical conditions, and the operative techniques for using consciousness to affect the body's state. Dream incubation was a documented, institutionalized practice in the Egyptian temple tradition, and its function as an operative medical procedure connects directly to what the 6 medical books apparently described. At specific temple complexes, the Serapeum at Memphis, the Ptah Temple at Memphis, Abydos, individuals with medical conditions would undergo a preparation period involving dietary restriction, ritual purification, and specific induction procedures, then sleep within the temple precincts. Dreams occurring during this sleep were considered diagnostic and sometimes curative. The Egyptian medical tradition understood certain disease states as conditions of consciousness producing physical symptoms, and the induction of specific altered states through the combination of fasting, ritual preparation, and sleep in a specific vibrational environment as a reproducible intervention. The medical books apparently described this mechanism at the theoretical level, the relationship between consciousness states and physical conditions that makes dream incubation work as medicine. What the surviving papyri preserve is the clinical protocol. What the 42 books apparently contained was the explanatory model. The Book of the Dead papyri, the most widely reproduced surviving category of Egyptian sacred text, are the clearest example of the tier distinction between the public layer and the scholarly layer. The Papyrus of Ani, the Papyrus of Hunefer, the Papyrus of Anhai, these texts were produced in large numbers, adapted for specific individuals, and represent the publicly accessible navigation tools for post-mortem consciousness. They contain 189 spells for passage through the judgment hall and the challenges of the duat. They contain the names of the 42 assessors before whom the heart is weighed, 42, the same number as the books. This is not coincidence. The 42 assessors of the judgment hall and the 42 books of Jehuti are the same principle in two different registers. The Book of the Dead is the public navigation tool for the passage that the 42 books described at the theoretical level. The 42 assessors of the Judgment Hall are not 42 arbitrary guardians. In the Hermopolitan cosmological framework, 42 corresponds to the full range of moral domains that Ma'at governs, 6 domains for each of the 7 conditions of existence that the tradition mapped. Each assessor governs a specific domain of action within which a specific deviation from Ma'at is possible. The declaration before the assessors in the Book of the Dead is not a performance for divine observers. It is a diagnostic procedure, a systematic traversal of the entire domain map of human action, checking for alignment with Ma'at in each domain. The 42 books contain the theoretical basis of that map, the full description of each of the 42 domains, and the mechanics by which alignment is achieved during the lifetime. The Book of the Dead gives you the declaration. The 42 books apparently gave you the practice that makes the declaration accurate rather than merely ritual. The Papyrus of Ani contains a sequence that surviving fragmentary references to the 42 books allow us to recognize as an application of what was in the books on post-mortem consciousness. Spell 125, the weighing of the heart against the feather of Ma'at, involves the deceased declaring their purity before 42 assessors. The declaration is a specific list of what the deceased claims not to have done, but this is the public version. The restricted version, the one the 42 books contained, apparently described not the declaration of purity, but the mechanism by which purity in the Ma'at sense is actually achieved during the lifetime, so that the declaration at the judgment hall reflects a genuine state rather than a ritual performance. The public text gives you the words to say. The operative text apparently gave you the instruction for becoming the person who can say them truthfully. One is a ritual tool. The other is a transformation manual. One survived. One did not. The documented connection between Pythagoras and the Egyptian priestly tradition is one of the most important pieces of evidence for understanding what the 42 books contained and how it was transmitted outside the written layer. Multiple ancient sources, Diodorus Siculus, Porphyry, Iamblichus, record that Pythagoras spent between 13 and 22 years in Egypt, studying with the priests at Memphis, Diospolis, and Heliopolis. The Egyptian priests initially refused his request for instruction, and only after Pythagoras submitted to the full Egyptian preparatory requirements, circumcision, dietary restrictions, the full ritual preparation sequence, Did the priests transmit to him what they considered appropriate for a non-Egyptian initiate? What Pythagoras brought back to Greece, the doctrine of the music of the spheres, the sacred significance of specific numerical ratios, the transmigration of the soul, the silence requirement for students, the prohibition on writing down esoteric knowledge, maps almost precisely onto the categories that Clement's catalogue assigns to the 42 books. Pythagoras was in the houses of life. He received a portion of what the 42 books contained through oral transmission, and he was prohibited from writing it down and kept that prohibition. What became the Pythagorean mathematical and harmonic tradition is the partial oral echo of a written tradition that no longer exists. What can be said with structural confidence about who decided what would remain? Not a single actor, not a coordinated conspiracy across centuries. What the evidence supports is a layered process in which multiple actors, operating according to consistent structural logic, arrived at the same result without coordination. The Egyptian tradition made the primary selection, establishing over 2 millennia which knowledge should be written at all, and in which tier of written access. The Ptolemaic library system preserved what the Egyptians had decided was appropriate for scholarly access. The institutional church preserved through monastic copying what it found philosophically compatible and treated as magical dangerous, what it found operatively threatening. The Hermetic orders of the Renaissance preserved the cosmological vocabulary and underemphasized the operative mechanism. At each stage, the same structural principle operated: preserve what orients, suppress what enables. Nobody planned the specific shape of the survivals. The shape emerged from consistent application of the same logic across different actors and different centuries. The 42 books of Jehuti are not the only ancient comprehensive sacred library to be systematically lost. The Zoroastrian tradition records that the 21 Nasks, the complete corpus of the Avesta, covering law, cosmology, medicine, astronomy, ethics, and ritual, were burned by Alexander the Great during his Persian campaign in 330 BC. 2 copies reportedly existed, one in the royal archives at Persepolis, one in the Alexandrian library. Both were destroyed. What survives of the Avesta today represents less than a third of the original. The parallel with the 42 books is structural, a comprehensive ancient sacred knowledge tradition documented by ancient sources as complete, reduced by specific destruction events to a fraction. These are not isolated events. They are instances of a consistent pattern, the systematic reduction of indigenous knowledge systems at the historical moment when those systems would have provided the theoretical foundation for independence from emerging imperial structures. Every major ancient civilization had a version of the 42 books. Most of them were burned. The phrase, "complete knowledge of the universe," requires one more layer of translation. In the Egyptian cosmological framework, the universe is not a collection of objects, forces and laws that can in principle be completely documented in 42 volumes. The universe is a self-maintaining dynamic system, in the terminology of modern systems theory, a self-referential, self-regulating, self-knowing process. Complete knowledge of such a system is not an inventory of its contents. It is knowledge of the organizing principle through which the system maintains itself. Ma'at is that organizing principle. Complete knowledge of Ma'at, expressed across every domain in which its operation can be observed: medicine, astronomy, music, consciousness, law, ritual, cosmology, is what the 42 books apparently contained. This is why the loss is not analogous to the loss of an encyclopedia. An encyclopedia could, in principle, be reconstructed from surviving evidence. The loss of the 42 books is the loss of the operating model, the explanatory framework within which all the observable facts are coherent and applicable. What survives is data without the theory, facts without the framework, fragments without the organizing principle. Hypatia of Alexandria died in 415 AD, 24 years after Theophilus burned the Serapeum. She was not primarily a mathematician, though her mathematical contributions were real. She was the last known carrier of the Alexandrian Neoplatonic transmission, the tradition that maintained active engagement with the operative layer of Egyptian priestly knowledge. Her students described receiving instruction from her that went beyond anything she published. Her student Synesius, in Letters That Survive, describes knowledge that required direct transmission and was not appropriate for writing. When a mob murdered Hypatia on the street in 415 AD, they were not killing a mathematician. They were ending a transmission line. After 415 AD, there is no documented figure in Alexandria who claims to hold both the exoteric and the esoteric layers of the Egyptian Hermetic tradition simultaneously. The exoteric layer continued in manuscript form. The operative layer, which Hypatia transmitted directly to students who could receive it, has no documented continuation in the Alexandrian line. Proclus of Athens, who lived from 412 to 485 AD, represents the final systematic attempt in the ancient world to preserve the operative layer of the Platonic Hermetic tradition within an institutional framework. His Theologia Platonica and Elements of Theology are among the most rigorous systematic expositions of Neoplatonic metaphysics to survive from antiquity. But what is significant about Proclus for the 42 books question is not his written output. It is the character of what he was, by his own account, transmitting to a small number of students in contexts that left no written record. His student Marinus's biography describes Proclus receiving initiations in multiple traditions, practicing specific operative techniques for what Marinus calls upward ascent, and maintaining that the written texts were maps rather than territories. When the Emperor Justinian closed the Athenian Academy in 529 AD, 44 years after Proclus died, the last institutionally located holder of whatever operative Neoplatonic transmission Proclus carried became a refugee. The philosophers who fled went to Persia. Whether they carried the transmission or only its map is the question the historical record does not answer. The emerald tablet, the tabula smaragdina, appears in the Arabic textual tradition in the 6th to 8th centuries, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, and contains 13 verses that the entire Western alchemical and Hermetic tradition treated as the compressed statement of the complete operative principle. The emerald tablet survived precisely because it is compressed past the point of practical utility. It describes the principle without providing the content. The tradition that produced the 42 books apparently built the emerald tablet as a summary, a pointer, a navigational marker that would survive any destruction. It did. But a summary without the text it summarizes is a signpost pointing to a destination that has been demolished. The signpost is intact, the destination is gone. What the Emerald Tablet communicates without the 42 books is exactly as much as a table of contents communicates without the book. The existence of chapters, not their content. The principle that, as above, so below, is the governing law of Ma'at's operation at every scale. The 42 books were the documentation of what that law actually looks like at each scale. The Emerald Tablet is the sentence. The 42 books were the proof. The fragments of Hermes that survived are not random survivals from an undifferentiated loss. They are consistent in their incompleteness. Every surviving Hermetic text describes a state of consciousness, a cosmological structure, a principle of operation, and stops precisely at the point where description becomes instruction. The Asclepius mourns its own incompleteness explicitly. It describes itself as a fragment of a larger transmission and says that the larger transmission no longer exists. The 17 texts of the Corpus Hermeticum describe the 7 spheres, the garments of descent, the principle of gnosis, and do not provide the operative sequence for actually moving through the spheres. The Stobaeus fragments describe the phenomenology of the return without giving the procedure. The Emerald Tablet encodes the complete operative principle in 13 verses that are compressed past the point of practical utility without the accompanying instruction. Every surviving fragment is a pointer toward the content of the 42 books. None of them is that content. The 17 texts of the Corpus Hermeticum, compiled from earlier Greek manuscripts in their current forms sometime between the 2nd and 4th centuries AD, describe the Hermetic cosmological system with sophistication and internal consistency. But the gap between 17 texts of philosophical dialogue and 42 texts of comprehensive technical knowledge is not quantitative. It is categorical. The Corpus Hermeticum contains Poemandres, a cosmological narrative of creation and return. It contains Asclepius, a philosophical dialogue on the nature of divine and human reality. What it does not contain is any of the specific technical content that Clement's catalogue assigns to the 42 books. No operative description of the music-consciousness relationship, no systematic treatment of the celestial mechanics as applied to consciousness, no technical manual on post-mortem navigation, no description of the operative procedure for moving through the 7 spheres and beyond. The Corpus Hermeticum is the philosophical foundation for the technical knowledge. It is the theory without the practice. The 42 books were, based on the internal evidence of the Corpus Hermeticum itself, the technical library that the philosophical foundation was written to introduce. The structure of the survivals is itself a form of evidence for deliberate selection. Random loss from fire and neglect would produce a random sample of the original corpus, fragments of cosmological description, fragments of operative instruction, fragments of ritual text, in proportions reflecting their original distribution. What we have instead is a highly non-random sample, complete preservation of cosmological description, complete preservation of structural mapping, nearly complete absence of operative instruction. The probability of this distribution arising from random loss is extremely low. The probability of this distribution arising from selection, either deliberate single-point selection or distributed selection by multiple actors applying the same structural criterion, is much higher. The fragments we have are not what fire left. They are what selection preserved. The Arabic Islamic scholars of the 8th through 12th centuries conducted the most systematic recovery of ancient Greek and Egyptian knowledge between the end of the Alexandrian tradition and the Renaissance. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad undertook systematic translation of Greek philosophical, mathematical, astronomical, and medical texts into Arabic, including Hermetic texts that have since been lost in their Greek originals. The Arabic Hermetic tradition that emerged contains material that cannot be found in the Greek Corpus Hermeticum, specifically material describing operative practices for working with specific planetary configurations and their effects on consciousness, which aligns structurally with what the 4 astronomical books in Clement's catalogue would have contained. What Jabir ibn Hayyan wrote about operative principles underlying material transformation, what Al-Kindi wrote about the influence of stellar rays as a technical field, what the Ikhwan al-Safa wrote about the harmony of the spheres as operative principle. These are all fragments of the Egyptian operative tradition, arriving in Arabic dress, pointing toward the content of the books that did not survive the Serapeum fire. What all of them point toward when read as a coherent set of pointers rather than as independent documents is the same thing. The mechanism, the operative sequence, how consciousness actually moves through the transitions that the cosmological map describes. The 42 books apparently contain this. Clement's catalogue says so, the Asclepius's Mourning says so, the Edfu inscription's Secret of Secrets category says so. The discourse on the 8th and 9th says so by demonstrating, in its specific partial way, what the full version would have provided. The mechanism is what every institutional system that built authority on controlling human access to the divine, Egyptian priestly hierarchy, Roman institutional church, Renaissance Hermetic orders, had consistent motivation to restrict. The cosmological map can be preserved because the map, without the mechanism, produces orientation without the ability to navigate independently. The mechanism produces independent navigation. The mechanism is the thing that was selectively not preserved. The Egyptian priestly tradition's fundamental approach to knowledge transmission was oral, and this fact is structurally important for understanding what the destruction of the 42 books did and did not destroy. The written documents were memory aids, training materials, and accessible codifications of what the tradition transmitted through direct person-to-person instruction. When the documents burned, what was lost was the accessible written layer, the layer appropriate for scholarly transmission to practitioners outside the innermost initiation. The deeper oral transmission, by the nature of oral tradition, cannot be burned. It can only be discontinued by the death of every person carrying it without transmission to another. What the Serapeum destruction and Hypatia's murder accomplished together was not the simultaneous elimination of both layers. It was the elimination of the written and the discontinuation of the institutional framework within which the oral layer was transmitted. Without institutional structure, transmission becomes irregular, incomplete, and eventually, over enough generations, a matter of reconstruction from fragments rather than transmission from a continuous line. The Nag Hammadi codices were found in December 1945. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in early 1947 by a Bedouin shepherd who threw a stone into a cave at Qumran and heard ceramic breaking. Two discoveries, 1,600 years after burial, in the same general region of the ancient Mediterranean world, within 18 months of each other. Both collections contain material that was not in the institutional manuscript traditions of the religions that surrounded their original community, material that had been actively suppressed, categorized as heretical, or simply allowed to disappear from the official traditions. Both sets of discoveries pointed toward the same conclusion. The official traditions had not preserved the complete record. They had preserved a selection. The buried texts describe the mechanism. The official texts describe the map. The Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation, the earliest surviving text in the Kabbalistic tradition, dating in some scholarly estimates to the 2nd century AD, describes the creation of the universe through 32 paths of wisdom, 22 Hebrew letters, and 10 sephirot. The structural parallel with the Egyptian 42 books is not numerical. It is functional. Both describe the same underlying claim, that the universe is self-encoding, that it generates the key to its own structure within itself in the domain of language, sound, and number. Both treat this self-encoding as a technical field that can be studied, mastered, and applied. The Hebrew tradition preserves this technical framework in the Kabbalistic corpus, with the Sefer Yetzirah at its foundation, the Zohar as its elaboration, and centuries of active commentary and living transmission sustaining it into the present. The Egyptian tradition had the same framework in the 42 books, with the Book of the Dead as its accessible application layer. The Kabbalistic tradition survived. The Egyptian tradition did not. Same claim. Radically different degrees of preservation. The surviving fragments of the 42 books tradition are not complete. They cannot produce independent navigation without context, without initiatory framework, without the transmission line that Hypatia represented, and that ended with her death. But they are not nothing. They are the edges of the missing knowledge, the fingerprints of what is absent, and the fingerprints are specific enough to allow the reconstruction of the shape of what was lost. From the Stobaeus fragments, from the discourse on the 8th and 9th, from the medical operative hints in the surviving papyri, from the astronomical precision whose motivation can be inferred, from the musical operative principles that Pythagorean fragments preserve, from the specific structure of the Book of the Dead navigation tools, the general architecture of what the 42 books contained can be reconstructed, not the content. The architecture, the categories, the levels of operation, the relationship between the different domains of knowledge. And the architecture, once understood, allows a different relationship to the fragments, not as interesting ancient texts to be studied academically, but as pointers toward a territory that the fragments are calibrated to produce orientation in, if the person reading them understands what Jehuti designed them to do. The acoustic evidence from modern studies of Egyptian ceremonial spaces has added an unexpected dimension to the two music books in Clement's catalogue. Studies of Egyptian temple chambers at Karnak, the Valley of the Kings, and the Dendera temple complex have documented that these spaces were not acoustically accidental. The chambers and ritual spaces of major Egyptian temples were constructed with acoustic properties that produce specific resonant frequencies in the range of 111 Hz, a frequency that, in controlled studies, produces measurable changes in the coherence pattern of human brainwave activity, specifically in the theta range associated with states of expanded awareness. The resonance patterns are consistent with spaces designed for specific acoustic induction of specific states of consciousness. The two music books in the 42 books catalogue, based on the acoustic evidence of the spaces within which the tradition operated, were technical manuals for an operative acoustic technology. The spaces that technology was used in still exist. The frequencies they generate can still be measured. The two books that describe the theory behind those frequencies are gone, but the resonance remains. The instrument is still tuned. The score was burned. The question, who decided what would remain, has an answer that the evidence supports, and the answer is distributed across multiple actors and multiple centuries. But it is coherent. The Egyptian tradition decided that the public layer could be widely reproduced, and the scholarly layer held in temple libraries. The Ptolemaic library system preserved the scholarly layer in accessible form. The institutional church destroyed the accessible scholarly layer while preserving through monastic copying what it found cosmologically compatible. The Nag Hammadi monks buried what they recognized as irreplaceable operative material before the institutional destruction completed. The Hermetic orders preserved the vocabulary and suppressed the mechanism. Each actor in this sequence applied the same implicit criterion: preserve what a powerful institution can use, suppress what makes powerful institutions structurally unnecessary. The fragments we have are what survived that criterion, and they are specifically the fragments that point toward what did not survive it. The distinction between reading the fragments as information and reading them as instruction is the distinction between knowing that a map exists and following the map. The fragments, the Stobaeus material, the discourse on the 8th and 9th, the Emerald Tablet, the acoustic spaces, the Book of the Dead's 42 assessors, are coherent as a set of pointers when read with the orientation the tradition describes. They point toward the same territory from different angles. They are calibrated to produce, in the consciousness that encounters them with the right orientation, not knowledge about a territory, but recognition of a territory the consciousness has already encountered without knowing what it was. The function of the fragments is not informational, it is confirmatory. They are designed to confirm, in the practitioner who is already on the path, that the path is real, that it goes somewhere, and that others have been on it before. The 42 books would have been the instruction manual. The fragments are the signs that the road exists. The books were the road itself. What you have is the evidence that a road exists. You are being asked by the fragments themselves whether you are going to treat that evidence as interesting historical information or as the beginning of an instruction. You are engaging with the pointing now. The fragments are not inert historical artifacts. They are functional. They are designed to produce, in the consciousness that encounters them with the right orientation, a specific form of productive incompleteness. Not the incompleteness of frustration, the incompleteness of a map that shows you the territory exists and shows you the general shape of the path, without giving you the GPS coordinates. The pointing is the inheritance. The GPS coordinates were in the 42 books. The 42 books are gone, the pointing toward where the coordinates are encoded, in consciousness, not in papyrus, in the operative tradition that never depended entirely on written text. That is what Jehuti built to survive. You are following that pointing right now. The question is not whether the road exists. The fragments answer that question definitively. The question is whether you follow it as information or as instruction. If you stayed until the end, write in the comments. I carry what they couldn't burn. I've placed another lesson on your screen right now, your next step on this path. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.